Chapter 2 of G.K. Chesterton's Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. G.K. Chesterton's Charles Dickens. Chapter 2 The Boyhood of Dickens. Charles Dickens was born at Landport in Portsea on February 7, 1812. His father was a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, and was temporarily on duty in the neighborhood. Very soon after the birth of Charles Dickens, however, the family moved for a short period to Norfolk Street, Bloomsbury, and then for a long period to Chatham, which thus became the real home, and for all serious purposes, the native place of Dickens. The whole story of his life moves like a Canterbury pilgrimage along the great roads of Kent. John Dickens, his father, was, as stated, a clerk, but such mere terms of trade tell us little of the tone or status of a family. Browning's father, to take an instance at random, would also be described as a clerk and a man of the middle class. But the Browning family and the Dickens family have the color of two different civilizations. The difference cannot be conveyed merely by saying that Browning stood many strata above Dickens. It must also be conveyed that Browning belonged to that section of the middle class which tends, in the small social sense, to rise; the Dickenses to that section which tends in the same sense to fall. If Browning had not been a poet, he would have been a better clerk than his father, and his son probably a better and richer clerk than he. But if they had not been lifted in the air by the enormous accident of a man of genius, the Dickenses, I fancy, would have appeared in poorer and poorer places, as inventory clerks, as caretakers, as addressers of envelopes, until they melted into the masses of the poor. Yet at the time of Dickens's birth and childhood, this weakness in their worldly destiny was in no way apparent. Especially it was not apparent to the little Charles himself. He was born and grew up in a paradise of small prosperity. He fell into the family, so to speak, during one of its comfortable periods, and he never in those early days thought of himself as anything but as a comfortable middle-class child, the son of a comfortable middle-class man. The father whom he found provided for him was one from whom comfort drew forth his most pleasant and reassuring qualities, though not perhaps his most interesting and peculiar. John Dickens seemed, most probably, a hearty and kindly character, a little florid of speech, a little careless of duty in some details, notably in the detail of education. His neglect of his son's mental training in later and more trying times was a piece of unconscious selfishness which remained a little acrimoniously in his son's mind through life. But even in this earlier and easier period, what records there are of John Dickens give out the air of a somewhat idle and irresponsible fatherhood. He exhibited towards his son that contradiction in conduct which is always shown by the too thoughtless parent to the too thoughtful child. He contrived at once to neglect his mind, and also to overstimulate it. There are many recorded tales and traits of the author's infancy, but one small fact seems to me, more than any other, to strike the note and give the key to his whole strange character. His father found it more amusing to be an audience than to be an instructor, and instead of giving the child intellectual pleasure, called upon him, almost before he was out of petticoats, to provide it. Some of the earliest glimpses we have of Charles Dickens shows him to us perched on some chair or table, singing comic songs in an atmosphere of perpetual applause. So almost as soon as he can toddle, he steps into the glare of the footlights. He never stepped out of it until he died. He was a good man, as men go in this bewildering world of ours, brave, transparent, tender-hearted, scrupulously independent and honorable. He was not a man whose weaknesses should be spoken of without some delicacy and doubt. But there did mingle with his merits all his life this theatrical quality, this atmosphere of being shown off. a sort of hilarious self-consciousness. His literary life was a triumphal procession. He died drunken with glory. And behind all this 9 years' wonder that filled the world, behind his gigantic tours and his 10,000 editions, the crowded lectures and the crashing brass, behind all the thing we really see is the flushed face of a little boy singing music-hall songs to a circle of aunts and uncles. And this precocious pleasure explains much, too, in the moral way. Dickens had all his life the faults of the little boy who is kept up too late at night. The boy in such a case exhibits a psychological paradox. He is a little too irritable because he is a little too happy. Dickens was always a little too irritable because he was a little too happy. Like the overwrought child in society, he was splendidly sociable, and yet suddenly quarrelsome. In all the practical relations of his life was what the child is in the last hours of an evening party, genuinely delighted, genuinely delightful, genuinely affectionate and happy, and yet in some strange way fundamentally exasperated and dangerously close to tears. There was another touch about the boy which made his case more peculiar, and perhaps his intelligence more fervid, the touch of ill health. It could not be called more than a touch, for he suffered from no formidable malady, and could always through life endure a great degree of exertion, even if it was only the exertion of walking violently all night. Still the streak of sickness was sufficient to take him out of the common, unconscious life of the community of boys, and for good or evil, that withdrawal is always a matter of deadly importance to the mind. He was thrown back perpetually upon the pleasures of the intelligence, and these began to burn in his head like a pent and painful furnace. In his own unvaryingly vivid way, he has described how he crawled up into an unconsidered garret, and there found, in a dusty heap, the undying literature of England. The books he mentions chiefly are Humphrey Clinker and Tom Jones. When he opened those two books in the garret, he caught hold of the only past with which he is at all connected, the great comic writers of England of whom he was destined to be the last. It must be remembered, as I have suggested before, that there was something about the country in which he lived, and the great roads along which he travelled, that sympathized with and stimulated his pleasure in this old picaresque literature. The groups that came along the road, that passed through his own town out of it, were of the motley, laughable type that tumbled into ditches or beat down the doors of taverns under the escort of Smollett and Fielding. In our time the main roads of Kent have upon them very often a perpetual procession of tramps and tinkers unknown on the quiet hills of Sussex, and it may have been so also in Dickens' boyhood. In his neighbourhood were definite memorials of yet older and yet greater English comedy. From the height of Gad's Hill, at which he stared unceasingly, there looked down upon him the monstrous ghost of Falstaff, who might well have been the spiritual father of all Dickens' adorable knaves, Falstaff, the great mountain of English laughter and English sentimentalism, the great healthy, humane English humbug, not to be matched among the nations. At this eminence of Gad's Hill Dickens used to stare even as a boy, with the steady purpose of some day making it his own. It is characteristic of the consistency which underlies the superficially erratic career of Dickens that he actually did live to make it his own. The truth is that he was a precocious child, precocious not only on the more poetical, but on the more prosaic side of life. He was ambitious as well as enthusiastic. No one can ever know what visions they were that crowded into the head of the clever little brat as he ran about the streets of Chatham, or stood glowering at Gad's Hill. But I think that quite mundane visions had a very considerable share in the matter. He longed to go to school, a strange wish, to go to college, to make a name, nor did he merely aspire to these things. The great number of them he also expected. He regarded himself as a child of good position, just about to enter on a life of good